Hey Bernie, what's on your mind today?
Well, I'm thinking about what I promised last time, that I would kind of put myself under the microscope just a bit, a tad, because the last um, podcast was, to me, very important, um, because it was dealing with how do you find the truth, and then how do you express it, and the problem of finding it, and how it's so important to know what you feel, and we're not trained to do that. That's why we have to go to a shrink and we have to pay money in order to have a really intimate talk and relationship and discoveries about ourselves, which is frankly institutionally normal, but frankly, it's also abnormal. Okay. I mean, we should be able to go to our wives, our friends, people we know, and we should be able to have those conversations. And instead, we save them for a guy we got to pay money for. All right. It's, it shows us how rational and cold we've become. And frankly, the conversations we're having with the therapist, if we're not boring him or her to death, are truer. We're speaking truer to this guy we hardly know, and then we got to pay him, okay? Than we are to the people we love, the people we want to impress, respect, okay? Um, and most of what we're saying in our lives, we talk too fucking much, okay? We're not quiet enough, especially Jews like me, okay? When I was a kid, I was referred to as the Jew with the runaway tongue, okay? And think of the Knesset, the loudest probably parliament in the whole world, okay? Italians, ethnics, we all talk a lot. So does the other people. Here's the problem. No matter whether we're quiet and we're talking shyly or we're talking quietly, but or whether we're loud, most of the time we're not saying anything. So most of the time we're bored. And most of the time people feel obligated to pretend they're listening or listen. And if it's not threatening, they might be listening. But nobody is obligated to listen to anyone else. And as a teacher, this became very important to me. Nobody was obligated to listen to me. Okay. And they didn't unless I was telling them some kind of truth. So I had to find it for myself. And I want to say if you find yourself not listening, you're either afraid of what the person is saying and don't want to hear it. They're telling the truth, or they're lying and they're boring you to death. Most of the time, that is what we're doing. Okay. And that is why we have shrinks. And that is why we talk about social emotional learning as a whole separate entity, you know. Uh, and so this is what I dealt with last time. So the question is clearly, we're speaking untruth to power because it takes us so long to find out what the truth is. And it's too scary. So we go to war. We have to wait for history to tell us our real perspective. Okay. How do you know? Did you know the Vietnam was wrong? How did you know the Iraq invasion was a bad idea? How did you know somebody was lying? Okay. And you have to be able to listen and see and find this out in order to not only speak truth to power, but to speak truth to yourself and anybody else and listen to it. And they're both important. The art of conversation has been hijacked by rationality, by quantification. Okay. Look, uh, let's say we're in a middle school, high school, elementary school classroom. I mean, ever since what, the 50s, class participation. Class participation is an issue that it's on your report card that goes to your parents. Does the child Bernie participate in class? Okay. Now, the assessors that come in to evaluate that, they evaluate pupil teacher interaction, they're talking to each other, and pupil pupil interaction. Well, I've looked at thousands of these. My daughter did a whole thing with assessments, looked at more than that at the humanities lab at Harvard, okay, and came up with the same thing. Nobody ever asked about the quality of what anybody's saying. It's only how much, and you check it off. And if you check off a lot, if you check off that people are running their mouths all over the place, you look great as a teacher. It doesn't matter what the hell they're saying. If you do people teacher, same thing. It's not the quality. We've lost our sense of quality. Okay. And in terms of conversation, I used to be all for it. Okay. And then I found myself telling the kids, y'all are saying shit. Okay, you're not saying anything. You're either being pedantic or or what have you in literature classes, history classes, whatever. And and um, uh, and I realized, well, I'll tell you what it's like, Bruce. There's an old buddy of mine, a redneck friend down here, and he's stopped. He's about 84, and we were out having drinks with some friends, and he couldn't hear shit. And I said, Bob, do you have your hearing aids in? And he said, no. This is not a guy who was very expressive. And he said, no. And you tend to listen to those people. There's a reason, all right? That you get through the noise quick. And I said, well, you can't hear anything. Why don't you put them on? And he said, you know, Bernie, I think I've heard enough. He meant over 81 years, it was just too much frigging noise, too much horse shit, too much small talk, too much of this, too much of that. And I remember I promised our listeners last time that since the last session the podcast was how do you find your story? How do you find your real voice? How do you become authentic? How can you do that by revealing yourself? Okay. How can you have the courage to do that or whatever? All right. How can you really show off and be your own parade or whatever? At least enjoy it. Okay. Which means you're listening fine. And we spent the whole podcast on that. Right. And so we don't have time to go back into that. But I did promise at the end that I would talk about how I found mine. And that's what I want to talk about today to the degree that I have. And I have to some degree. Okay. Uh, and it translated into my teaching, my writing, and everything else. It changed my classrooms completely. All right. When I first started teaching, I thought if everybody had their hand up when I walked in and was ready to talk, that I was doing great till I had to listen to them. Okay. And half the time they hadn't read the assignment, whatever, even if they had, especially a literature class or story class, they didn't know what their stories were. All right. So they have to find them. How do you find them? Well, here's how I found mine. It's about 1970, 71, and I'm the director of a staff development director for a learning institute, okay, in a state that's very good on education, okay. My boss is a guy we're going to call Jack, okay, and Jack, Jack was a charmer. He loved to be on television. He loved to be on state television. He loved showing the world what we were all doing. And I had a very talented group of people who I was working with, who I was responsible for. and they would branch out all over the state and do workshops. Some of them were English because it was open classroom time, and um, and they were great. Okay, and this is the same time when I discovered, which I revealed in an early podcast, that if I wasn't teaching, I couldn't teach teachers. That if I wasn't in a classroom, instead of phoning, doing conferences and so forth, then I wasn't worth crap. Okay. And a few first grade teachers let me know this, and they were right. Okay. They'd roll their eyes when I'd talk, for example. Hey, great move, Bernie, you know? All right. So excuse me, was the kind of guy he loved seeing himself on television. He loved the PR. Okay. Uh, he was, what's the word? Unfailingly nice, unfailingly charming, unfailingly supportive, totally successful. All right. So what happens is, uh, um, I found out that one of these talented people we were working with, that I was responsible for, that person had to resign, pregnant, and I was responsible for the hiring, and he had hired the governor's niece himself under me. Well, I was supposed to do that, and all I saw was a political appointment. I was furious. These people were working their asses off out there in the field, and so was I. And we were really trying to open up the schools. And he goes on and he picks a whole entire district out of 12 and makes a political appointment with somebody that doesn't know crap. Okay. All right. So I am really upset. And I go home. Now, the Jewish condition, of course, is OCD and obsessing. Talking too much, not too little. Okay. The maybe the Methodist tradition is condition is more just don't listen, shut it off, repress it, what have you. Okay, but we all have our different ways of avoiding what we need to feel. Now, I didn't even know enough to ask myself the question: what is it that I'm avoiding? Why am I talking so much? Why am I driving my wife Martha out of her mind? Why can't I shut up? Now, how do I know that I needed to do that? Because that's what she told me. She said, will you please shut up? Will you please be quiet? She's a Gentile. Okay. I talked around it. I talked over it. This bastard, this son of a bitch, this guy, I made fun of him. I mocked him. One obsession after another. Okay. And clearly, it wasn't the kind of obsession that was getting me to any truth. Martha got so sick of me talking about it. She said, go upstairs, be by yourself, get away from anybody. Shut up. Please shut up. Okay? Don't say another word for the rest of your life. Just shut up. Okay. And go write a poem about it. So I said, I've never written a poem. And I hadn't. I was a writer, but I'd never written poetry. And I'd never written that much creatively at the time either. That came kind of later. And so I went upstairs and I wrote a poem. It's about an 8-10 line poem. I can tell you the first 8 or 9 lines are so embarrassing that I consciously repressed them. They're awful. Okay. But then this other line came out at the end. And it was the truth, too, literally. But it was the last line of the poem. Jack was smoking his Pall Mall, his routine cigarette. He propped his legs, had his legs propped up on his desk. I'm coming in there screaming and yelling at him at the top of my lungs, all but throwing things. And he looks at me, his feet on the desk, cross legged, Pall Mall. and he smiles. He just sits there and smiles. And then he issues a thin line of smoke like a silent directive. I'll repeat it. He issues a thin line of smoke like a silent directive. And the poem ended. And I realized, look, this isn't, Robert Frost by any means, but for a guy who's never written a poem, that's a hell of a line. And even I could tell that never written a poem in his life. And that line comes out. And then, of course, when I write that, I feel fucking so clean and clear. It's unbelievable. So I come back downstairs and Martha says, what was it? So Martha says, I don't know how she knows. And I realized, what feeling was I avoiding? I talked so much, I talked myself away from the issue. Okay, beforehand. I write a poem. A feeling that is totally new to me comes out. And a line of poetry, it's terrific, comes out. So what have I learned? At least as a teacher, I knew to ask myself that question. What was I avoiding? And Martha said, it means you were obsessing all over the place, and instead of it getting anywhere, you were avoiding a feeling or feelings. Well, what feeling was I avoiding? I studied my own poetry, one line, and looked at it, and I didn't even have to think about it. He issued a thin line of smoke, like a silent directive with that smile on his face. And I realized there was not a goddamn thing I could do about this. I could rant, I could rave, I could throw things, I could raise hell, I could go bother Martha with it, but I'm avoiding truth. I'm avoiding what I'm feeling. So what was I avoiding? So people in the podcast, I hope you can understand this. What was the feeling? I studied my own line of poetry to find out. It was helplessness. I was avoiding this feeling of helpfulness. Now, what in society has trained me to go so far off the fucking deep end that I'll do anything to avoid a simple answer to a problem that's not even that difficult? All right, those feelings we avoid. And that was the podcast from last time. And uh, uh, Martha, my wife, she says, I don't know how she understood. I would like to think that she was so brilliant, because she is, that she said, go write a poem because she thought it would help me find out something, discover something. She knew enough to know that. She was really telling me, would I leave her alone? This is not intimacy. This is not respect. This is a bother. Okay? And of course, I go up there. She's not surprised. Then, when I started learning to write creatively, I knew that I was not going to teach these kids or even other adults or other teachers later on like I was taught to write, because frankly, I was taught to write composition. I was really taught rhetoric. Say what you're going to say it, and then say that you've said it. Now, that's important to learn if you need that. But that's not natural. That's just not, for me, it was unnatural. I was narratively a storyteller. I was narratively should have gotten into it in my own way with a good lead and something interesting, where it's going and so forth. And so, of course, I had writer friends and in Atlanta at the time, and we all read each other our stuff over the phone. We'd encourage each other. And uh, uh, and I realized that one guy was drunk, and he was he was the founder of City Magazines, okay, Atlanta's, others too, and he was the warmest man I've ever met. Okay, he would we'd all meet, we'd drink, whatever. And I would read what they'd wrote and comment. They would read what I wrote and comment. And that's how I learned. And it was never anything except, Bernie, the most interesting thing you've written right here is not about you in Atlanta, but you in your hometown. And I learned there's better stuff down there when you first start writing, when you go younger. Well, this guy, Jim, drunk, he was kind of the father of us all. And from what he called a front row town in Georgia, real small. And he would meet me at the Brandy House in Buckhead, in Atlanta. And the first time he met with me, okay, we met together. We'd heard about each other. We knew about each other. I knew all about him, even if he didn't know much about me. And he said, "Let me ask you something, Shine." This is all very Southern. And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "How many Miss Americas have you had sex with?" Except he didn't say have sex. Okay. Well, I'm sitting there thinking, hell, I thought we were going to talk about writing. Well, shit, that was a funny line. You got this novice who doesn't know crap. You got this old guy who knows everything. And he starts off with that line. He got my attention. That's what I paid attention to. I paid attention to what I learned writing and talking about it rather than how I was taught writing in school. And that's the way my wife and I did it when we taught in school. It was the same thing. What's funny? What's interesting? Where's your truth? I did the same thing with all those kids that Martha had done with me every time it came up. Your grandmother died. Let's find out what's wrong. Why do you have bad feelings about it? Like I said in the last podcast, you don't relate to your daddy. Oh, you find out it's because when your sibling was born. Let's look at that. And you find out your truth and you express it. And what happens as a result of that? You don't feel helpless. You feel more, what's the word? It's not so much more important, more powerful, okay? And because you know the answer. And sometimes it makes you more intimate. For example, how did it affect me and Jack back at the Learning Institute? Well, he didn't have me all over his ass all the time, and he wasn't avoiding me all the time anymore, running from me all the time anymore, or when it got really bad, putting me down in a group if he could. And I didn't know why I'd been doing it. That's how little we know about ourselves. And to find that voice, which is hard to do, I tell the kids, shut up. Don't say anything. Okay, my students, if you have to, lie down. What if I go to sleep? Go to sleep. It'll be better than what you're saying now. Okay? Be really quiet and you let that feeling come up. You can do it through writing, you can do it just lying there, but it's solitude, it's quiet. So they're all lying down there at the same time. And when a feeling comes, they start to express it. Remember, it's hard to get to. You're going to bore me as much as you're going to bore your therapist. I'm going to bore you as much as I bore my therapist. Okay? So it's not easy, but you listen and try to get them to get to it. For example, well, if your relationship is so great with your dad, how come you avoid him on the weekends? You get contradictions, you get inconsistencies. You said you avoided him and didn't want to be around him. Well, why is this such a great relationship? Okay. And then he finds out, okay, this goes back to sibling rivalry when the baby was born 10 years ago. All right. Jealousy. And he just hadn't gotten over it. He hadn't faced it. It's like the little girl in the last podcast that couldn't cry at her mother's funeral, at her grandmother's funeral, and so therefore thought, I don't love her enough. She couldn't cry because she did. Those feelings come up just like that feeling came up for me with that line in that poem. What was that feeling? Helplessness. What's the result of that? The result is respect, a better relationship, and me shutting up right now.